Good Friday, and today we commemorate, I hate to say celebrate, although it is a celebration for Christians, because this is where our debt is paid. But on this day, I often prefer the word commemorate, because it just reminds me that it was my sins that put him on the cross, mine and everybody else that he came to forgive their sins. Today I wanted to look at Isaiah 53. And so if you have your Bibles, I want to look at a few verses from Isaiah 53 as we consider the crucifixion of Christ and what it means and what the whole point of it was. So as a primer to that, something about the book of Isaiah. Sorry, collecting my thoughts there. The book of Isaiah is an amazing book. It has so much prophecy about Jesus Christ in such great detail, often in better detail than the Gospels accounts give us. And so you would think that a people that were well acquainted with their scriptures and their prophecies would see Christ in these places, but we know minds are darkened. And I don't say that with any kind of animosity toward the Jewish people. The apostles, the disciples, didn't get it until after the resurrection either, even though we come across passages like this one that so clearly depict the crucifixion. Another sort of cool historical fact about Isaiah, the book of Isaiah, is when the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in the 1940s, they found basically over 90% complete Isaiah scroll. And that scroll, which was dated to before the time of Christ, matches what we have in our book, thousands of years later, in our book in the Jewish scriptures of Isaiah. In other words, this text is untainted. This text predates Christ. We, of course, as Christians would believe that, but know that. What a beautiful thing that here, almost 2,000 years later, they find this scroll and it perfectly matches what I'm about to read to you. And so from Isaiah 53, we're going to read 4, 5, and 6. But first, a little story or a little movie recollection. A number of years ago, maybe it's 20 years now, I don't know, that's how you know you're getting older, but there was a movie called The Green Mile with Tom Hanks in it. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with that movie or not, but The Green Mile represented the walk the prisoners in this prison would have to do to go through. It felt like a mile because they were walking to their execution. And Tom Hanks was the warden of this prison. He had the job nobody would want unless you're sadistic, but to carry out the execution of those convicted of capital offense. And so there was this guy in the movie, and he was kind of like a mice and men type of a guy, like just a real big hulking guy, but really just very simple in his outlook on life, simple in his thoughts. He probably had the cognitive abilities of a child. A very sweet guy, and he is falsely accused of murder, and he is sentenced to death on the Green Mile. And as they all would get to know this guy, they realized there's no evil in him. And then they started to realize that he had the power to heal people. And he would place his hands on people, and they'd be healed. But there was an interesting sort of interchange that would take place in the healing, because as he would heal people, he would become weak. In other words, power would go out from him. And of course, this is not a Christian movie, right? But there's symbolism here. Power would go out from him and heal the person, and that he would essentially be taking on their sickness, their whatever it was that was ailing them, and it was creating almost death in him. Of course, the movie climaxes at the end, and the warden, he wishes he didn't have to do this. It almost reminds me of the centurion after he crucifies Christ, saying, "Surely this was a son of God," or the Son of God. It always amazes me when Hollywood uses Christian themes. And as I watch that movie, you should watch that movie. It's a very touching movie if you liked it. But one thing that occurred to me is we say Christ has borne our griefs. That's what we're going to read in Isaiah 53 in a second here. And what does that really mean? Like he bore our griefs. And so I want to read that to you, and then we'll jump into it in the crucifixion. So from Isaiah 53. I'll actually start at verse 1, but I want to hone in on 4, 5, and 6. Who has believed what he has heard from us? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a young plant, like a root out of dry ground. So Israel was this dry, barren wasteland, and Christ is born like a tender shoot, a root out of dry ground. He has no form of majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men. This written hundreds of years before Christ came. A man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and as one from whom men hid their faces. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. So here's verse 4. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace. And with his wounds we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. And it goes on and on. He was oppressed and afflicted. This is the man of sorrows. I think Taylor spoke about this either this morning or one of the prior days. But what I want to do is hone in on verse 4. He has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. The words there translated as griefs and sorrows is actually the word for sickness and pain. So how is Christ borne the pain and the sickness of his people? I mean, surely he bore the pain while he was nailed to the cross. We get that. But I really think there's a lot more going on here. We know Jesus' ministry was a number of years, probably 3 years. It may have been as much as 4 years. Some maybe even said more. And in that time, he experienced highs and lows, like we've been studying in the Gospel of Mark, where there's times where there's great belief and there's times there's great unbelief. There's times where people come to him just because he's a miracle worker that can do something for him, and there's times where people come to him out of pure desperation because they recognize that they need him. They wanted to stone him many times. We remember Jesus protected the woman from being stoned, the woman caught in adultery, and then they picked up stones to stone him. Certainly he was identifying with his people. But this week, particularly Good Friday, the time between Holy Thursday and Good Friday, we see in compressed form an amazing set of truths in great detail in the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And when you put them together, this picture is painted of a man, Jesus Christ, who has surely and truly borne our sickness, our pain. He has borne our griefs and our sorrows in a very real way, not in a metaphorical way. If you think about all the healings that Christ has done in his ministry, and maybe even in just a few chapters in the Gospel of Mark that we've been studying on Sunday mornings, we see that Jesus, at the time of from his arrest to his death on the cross, experienced all those things he healed people of. Experienced them alone, too. We know that Jesus came to the brokenhearted, to those who are rejected and downcast, to those who are ashamed, and in the crucifixion, Don't we see Jesus rejected and downcast? All his friends left him. He had nobody. Faced hostile mobs and religious leaders. He hangs on the cross completely ashamed. He's naked. We don't like to think of that. The depictions put loincloths on him, and I think they should if they're going to depict anything. We don't want to see that or think of that, but think that God himself hanging on a cross before all men, rejected, despised, downcast, and ashamed, just like those people he came. And that's the part we get. But what about the actual healings? Well, there's a very interesting healing that occurs in the Gospel of Mark in chapter 8, where Jesus says to the disciples, don't you have eyes to see and ears to hear? And then he heals a deaf man and a blind man. But the healing of the blind man is fascinating because he takes this blind man outside the city, it says. So here this guy comes to him. They're in the city or the town where they were at, and he takes him outside. And how does he heal this man? Do you remember? But he spits on him. Very odd way, very tactile way, but spit is not a good thing. Many people would posit that people believed that life was in sort of the bodily fluids, the spit, and that was what Jesus was doing. But I think there's much, much more there. This blind man that Jesus heals, that he takes outside the city, that he actually spits on to heal him. Think back to Jesus' trial, where they ask him, are you the Messiah? Jesus says, I am. They scream blasphemy at him, and they tear their clothes, and then what do? But they blindfold him, and they spit on him. I can't help but think that in that moment, Christ being blinded, even if just temporarily, but not knowing as this mob is shouting him, of these religious leaders, there might have been 70 of them there, the Sanhedrin, and they're actually punching him, it says too, but they spit on him and he's blinded. Is he remembering the blind man from Mark chapter 8 that he healed in the very same way? Christ will also be taken outside the city to be crucified, as that blind man was taken outside to receive the healing. When Jesus in the trials, and the multiple trials, whether he stood before Herod or the Sanhedrin or Pilate, he was essentially silent. Very few words did he say. He answered one question to the Sanhedrin. I think he was completely silent with Herod, and he basically said one thing to Pilate. You would have no power if it weren't the power that I give you. Jesus Christ stood there as if he were deaf and mute, taking the insults, the false accusations, identifying in those moments with the deaf and the mute that he had healed. We remember the crippled man at the pool where Jesus heals him. He can't get into the pool. He can't move beyond the mat that he's at. Jesus says, don't you want to be well? He says, of course I want to be well. But I can't get into the pool. I'm lying here on the ground. And then when Jesus is carrying the cross, he falls. Can't walk. He needs to be helped up. They get a man named Simon to carry the cross. Jesus identifying with that man at the pool that couldn't get into the waters. You remember the demoniac, and we'll see the demoniac soon in Mark 5. The man was naked, screaming. He had a legion of demons in him. And he was cutting himself with rocks and just slashing at his own body, naked and flayed open. And yet, in this whole crucifixion ordeal, Jesus Christ is stripped and naked and stripped and whipped with that whip that had the shards of bone and rock over and over. And while Jesus himself was never demonically possessed, this whole activity involves demonic activity, and Jesus is falling victim to a legion of demonic activity, whether it's the religious leaders or the Romans or the hostile crowd that wants to crucify him. Very many of those people were the ones that were welcoming into Jerusalem just days before. Just like the demoniac, he was naked and his flesh laid open. Or the woman at the well, that she wanted water and she was thirsty, and Jesus told her, I give you living waters. This God himself, who created all things and created the waters, utters from the cross, I am thirsty, I thirst. Jesus fed 5,000 hungry people, which we know was many, many more people. Another time it said he fed 4,000 people. He was known for feeding people. This Jesus would be starving, emaciated at this whole ordeal. Like the lepers that Jesus healed, and like the leper we saw Jesus heal in Mark chapter 1, from all the beating and the cross on his back and the whips, his own flesh would be marred and disfigured and irritated, just like a leper's flesh would be. We remember the cripple that we preached on a few weeks ago, that he was completely, they called him the paralytic. He couldn't even move, probably paralyzed from the neck down. And when Jesus was crucified, hanging on the cross, and he couldn't move at all, was he identifying with that man that was laid out on that mat? Actually was lifted up and carried in through the ceiling by his four friends. And as he faced those moments of death, did he remember that just about a week before, his good friend Lazarus was dead and in a tomb? But we remember that on the fourth day, Jesus called Lazarus out of the tomb and he walked out. And that, of course, is what we look forward to in the resurrection of Christ on Sunday. But the point here is, Jesus, in a very real way, in a condensed form, in just a matter of hours, experienced all the infirmities of all the healings that he had done in his ministry. I really can't think of a healing that he had done that he didn't emblematically in some way experience, but more than just symbolically or emblematically, but in a really real way, experience that blindness as he's blindfolded and spit upon. Experience the cutting of the demoniac as he's being whipped and he's naked like that guy. And all the things we've gone over. You know, the Bible tells us we have a sympathetic high priest in Christ, because he has been tempted in every way as we are, and that word is meant tested. In other words, he's experienced everything we've experienced. And I think we see that in this crucifixion scene. But one thing you may question, and I have spoken to somebody recently about this, and they said, you know, Jesus has gone through everything that we have gone through, but what about the loss of a loved one, particularly maybe a child or a spouse? Like, did Christ feel that? Did he go through it? He wasn't married, and he had no children. And so maybe that's an aspect of Christ's ministry that he's missing. Could he really know what somebody who's lost a spouse or a child, can he really know what they're going through? Or you guys that have lost parents, could he know what that's like? Well, we know that one's an obvious one, right? Jesus says, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? It's a rare time that he's calling God not his father. In other words, he's being separated in some fashion, because you can never separate God, but he's experiencing a separation between he and the Father in a way he had never experienced before. So we get that he understands what it's like to lose a father. But what about a spouse or a child? Well, I thought about this when this person had said this to me. And you know what? And I think I've had people experience, because we have a lot of people in our church that have experienced these things, have we not? The loss of a child and the loss of a spouse. And I'm pretty sure I've had both of them brought to me. And you know what occurred to me? That we are the bride of Christ in the New Testament, right? And in the Old Testament, God is the husband of Israel. And are we not separated them from our bridegroom in our sin? And in the garden, and remember, Jesus was there, right? We don't know how that looks in the Trinity. We know that Christ was there in the beginning. He is an uncreated, he is God himself, always there, ever present, one with the Father. And so when Adam and Eve sin in the garden, and he promised, the day you eat of this tree, you shall surely die. And there's this separation now. And physical death will come upon all humanity, but spiritual death comes upon those who do not have Christ within them. But in that moment, when they eat of that fruit, and they cover and hide and blame, does Christ not there in that moment, does God not there in that moment lose to death his bride? See, Christ in a very real way knows what it is like to lose to death his spouse, but that's the whole rescue mission. That's why he was sent, to come back and redeem the spouse and to give the spouse life. We can never know how it pained God, Creator God, to lose fellowship with creation the way he did. And he's gone through great lengths to restore it. God is also called our Father. As a matter of fact, isn't Jesus in Isaiah called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father? Confuses some. How is Christ the Father? And yet he somehow is the Father of creation. And Jesus, at the end of his ministry, as he approaches Jerusalem, does he not look at Jerusalem and weep over it, saying, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often would I have gathered your children as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, but you were not willing." Jesus speaks to the people of Jerusalem, his chosen people in the nation of Israel, like a mother speaking to a child, like a parent speaking to a child, weeping over the loss of them. He has come to redeem his children. He has come to redeem his bride. And we know the Father knows in a very real way what it's like to lose a son in Christ. But again, this is not permanent. So if you've lost loved ones, the Lord has just impressed that upon my heart. That Christ has truly borne our real sickness and infirmities. He experienced it all. From the time he was arrested to the time he was executed. Not just the emotional detachment from people and the shame and the depression, but also the very physical, real infirmities that people feel. But in all of this story, Christ also felt loss and separation from loved ones. He is the bridegroom coming to redeem the bride. He is redeeming the children, making them children of God. This is who our Jesus is. This is what I want to reflect on this Good Friday, this most solemn of days in our church calendar. So hopefully that has spoken to you. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. We esteemed him stricken and smitten by God and afflicted. They mocked him on the cross. Look, where's God now? He did that for us. And just like Taylor said, at any moment, said this morning, any moment he could have come off the cross, but then his mission would not have been complete. So let's think about that as we go through our day today.